The tires of the old station wagon crunched over the gravel as Daniel McAllister and his son, Jack, made their way up the long, winding driveway. The farmhouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the darkening sky. Its once white paint was now peeling and faded, and the windows stared out like hollow, empty eyes. The place had an air of abandonment about it, as if it had been waiting for something, or someone, for a very long time. Daniel parked the car in front of the house and killed the engine. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant chirping of crickets. Jack sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring at the house with a mix of curiosity and unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, even though the house had been empty for years. "Well, here we are," Daniel said, trying to sound more upbeat than he felt. He glanced at Jack, who hadn't moved. "It's not much now, but with a little work, it'll be a nice place. A fresh start for both of us." Jack nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the house. He could feel something, a heaviness in the air, like the house itself was watching them, waiting. "Come on, buddy," Daniel said, patting his son's shoulder. "Let's go check it out." They got out of the car, and the gravel crunched underfoot as they walked to the front door. The porch creaked ominously as Daniel stepped onto it, and the old wood groaned under his weight. He took out a key, its metal cold and unfamiliar in his hand, and unlocked the door. The hinges protested as the door swung open, revealing a dark interior. The smell of dust and stale air wafted out, mixed with something else, something faint, almost imperceptible, but unsettling. Jack wrinkled his nose. "Smells like it's been closed up for 100 years, Daniel said, stepping inside. He fumbled for the light switch and found it just inside the door. The overhead light flickered on, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the room. The interior was just as run down as the exterior. The wallpaper was peeling, and the wooden floor was scuffed and covered in a thin layer of dust. Old furniture was scattered about, a battered sofa, a wooden rocking chair, and a dusty coffee table cluttered with old magazines and yellowing newspapers. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the house had been left untouched for decades. Jack followed his father inside, feeling the air grow colder as he crossed the threshold. He shivered and wrapped his arms around himself, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled in his stomach. "Let's take a look around," Daniel said, trying to sound cheerful. He walked further into the house, his footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. Jack hesitated for a moment before following him. They moved through the house room by room, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The kitchen was small and outdated, with an old-fashioned stove and a chipped porcelain sink. The cabinets were empty, save for a few cobwebs and some ancient-looking canned goods. The living room was slightly more inviting, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A thick layer of ash covered the hearth, and a few charred logs sat in the fireplace, remnants of the last fire that had burned there, who knows how many years ago. Jack lingered near the fireplace, staring at the blackened logs. He could almost imagine the house as it had been years ago, warm and cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and laughter echoing through the rooms. But that warmth was long gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that seemed to seep into his bones. "Dad," Jack said quietly, "are you sure this place is safe?" Daniel looked up from the kitchen counter, where he had been inspecting the ancient stovetop. He could hear the uncertainty in his son's voice and wanted to reassure him, but he also couldn't deny the eerie feeling that had settled over him since they'd arrived. "It's just old, Jack," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "We'll fix it up, make it our own. Once we get some lights on, it won't seem so bad." Jack wasn't convinced, but he nodded anyway. He knew his father was trying his best. The move had been hard on both of them, especially after what had happened with his mom. The house was supposed to be a new beginning, a way to leave the past behind. But something about it felt wrong, like they were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. They continued their tour, climbing the narrow staircase to the second floor. The steps creaked under their feet, and the railing wobbled dangerously when Daniel grasped it. The upstairs hallway was long and narrow, with several doors leading off into dark, empty rooms. Jack hesitated at the top of the stairs, his eyes drawn to the door at the far end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and he could just make out the edge of a bed frame and a large, dusty mirror. He felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the door. Something about that room felt wrong. "Hey, you okay?" Daniel asked, noticing that Jack had stopped. "Yeah," Jack said, shaking himself out of his daze. "Just thinking." Daniel followed Jack's gaze to the door at the end of the hall. "That's the master bedroom," he said. "Probably where your great-uncle slept." Jack nodded but didn't move any closer to the door. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an overwhelming urge to stay away from that room. "You go ahead," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll check out the other rooms." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "All right. I'll just take a quick look." Jack watched as his father walked down the hallway and pushed the door open. The hinges squealed, and the door swung inward, revealing the dim interior of the room. Daniel stepped inside, and Jack turned away, heading toward one of the other doors. He opened the door to a small bedroom, barely more than a closet, with a single, narrow bed pushed against the wall. The room was bare, save for the bed and a small dresser. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air was musty and stale. Jack wrinkled his nose and backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. He moved to the next room, which turned out to be a bathroom, complete with an old clawfoot tub and a rusted sink. The mirror above the sink was cracked, and the tiles on the floor were chipped and stained. He moved on to the last room on the floor, hoping for something less depressing. This room was slightly larger than the others, with two windows that let in the fading light. An old, threadbare rug covered the floor, and a large wardrobe stood against one wall. Jack stepped inside, relieved that this room didn't feel as ominous as the others. He crossed to the windows and looked out over the overgrown backyard, where a tangle of weeds and vines had taken over what had once been a garden. As he stared out at the yard, he thought he saw something move among the shadows. He squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the light was fading fast, and he couldn't be sure. A sudden creak from behind him made him jump, and he spun around, heart pounding. The wardrobe door had swung open, revealing a dark, shadowy interior. Jack stared at the open door, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He knew he hadn't touched the wardrobe, and there was no breeze that could have blown it open. It had opened on its own. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes fixed on the darkness within the wardrobe. He reached out a trembling hand and grasped the edge of the door, pulling it open wider. Inside, the wardrobe was empty, save for a few old hangers rattling on the rod. Jack let out a shaky breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He was being silly, letting his imagination run wild. It was just an old wardrobe, nothing more. But as he turned to leave the room, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from behind him. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and he realized it was coming from the wardrobe. Jack. His name, spoken in a low, breathy voice that sent chills racing down his spine. He didn't recognize the voice, but it was unmistakable. Someone was whispering his name. Jack. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The wardrobe door was still open, and the darkness within seemed to have deepened, becoming almost solid, like a shadow that had taken on form. Jack, come closer. The voice was hypnotic, drawing him in, making him want to step closer, to peer into the darkness. But another part of him, the part that was still sane, screamed at him to run, to get out of the room and away from whatever was inside that wardrobe. He took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving the dark interior of the wardrobe. The whispering grew more insistent, more urgent. Jack, come closer. He couldn't take it anymore. With a strangled cry, he turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. He raced down the hallway, nearly colliding with